Let us begin. So welcome everyone to our next Zoom time together for pastors, for leaders, staff of churches. I'm Dawn Toloyo. I'm the one who's sending out all the emails. So welcome, especially for those who are lay leaders and taking time out in the middle of your day to join us for this important conversation. And just by the response we've had and the signups for this one, as well as for Thursday night, clearly this is a topic on everyone's mind right now. And so we just want to do our best as the conference staff team to continue to be available and to resource in any way that we can and help keep these important conversations in front of us and give us these opportunities to discuss them together. So I am recording this and we will get it up on our website afterward in case you want to share it with anyone else. We ask that you keep yourself muted because there's so many people on this call. It will be lean more towards presentation this time with my colleagues Peter Sung and Greg Yee, and then also Pastor Mark Meredith at Pine Lake Covennat Church. They will each share some ideas. You know, really they've just been curating a bunch of resources and listening in on some webinars, like I'm sure many of you have too. And so they're here just to share some of that information that they've been hearing with us. If there is time, we will open it up for some discussion. You can certainly ask a question through the chat as well, if you have something or you're wanting more clarification on something that has been shared. And again, if we do run out of time, we certainly can schedule another time, you know, in the coming week or two to follow up and even have more discussion. So with that, I guess I will hand it over. Is it Greg or Peter who's going to start us off?
I'll start us off very quickly. Sorry for some of my typos here, but we are. This is what we're going to be doing in our short hour together. So I'm just going to introduce us a little bit and quickly get into where we are. Mark has been part of a cohort group, and Peter as well. And Peter has been tasked to helping curate some resources for you all. So we're wanting to walk through today's webinar and Thursday and kind of give you what we have and hear the questions that are coming from the front lines. And we're scheduling to get a letter out to chair people and lead pastors from what we've learned this week, just to inform all of our 74 churches. So that's part of what we're looking ahead. We're going to present today some things that we've learned, and I'm sure that you've been flooded in your email inboxes with potential webinars and different people's takes on things. And certainly this is the topic, the current burning topic, as Dawn said. Where we are right now is that Montana has already allowed its churches to, in a cautious way, a staged way, go back. So they're in a very different place than Oregon and Washington. I don't know if there's anybody from Montana on the line right now, but I've been texting with Pastor Keith over at Life, and they are looking at a mid-May potential return, but there's a bunch of things that they have to consider right now. So in many ways, we could be learning some stuff from them as they are moving forward much quicker than we are out here in the West. So as you've been hearing, Governors Inslee and Brown, it does feel like you know, they're trying to consider everything around the economics of this quarantine as well as safety. Inslee had announced some openings with fishing and golfing and these kinds of things. I'm sure Governor Brown will be doing something similar, as the two states usually end up in a very similar place. But certainly churches, that's the big question. And so we do not see this, as we all know, being a light switch that's suddenly going to be flipped back on, but it's more realistically going to be a staged approach. And so part of what Peter and Mark and I will be presenting is some practical things that we need to consider in that staged approach. And then some overall, how do we frame this as we come out of these 2 months plus? And what do we need to be thinking about? What do we need to be considering? What is this new normal? More of the framing ideas about returning, okay? So with that, I'm just gonna hand it over to Peter and just have him share a bit.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. Crazy times, huh? Yeah. It was just interesting to me that as I was thinking about who will be sharing today, the three of us, Greg, myself, and Mark, were all church planters, at least in another lifetime. And I thought it was kind of apropos because church planters, their job is not to go in and change the terrain, but really figure out how to adapt to the terrain, how to speak the local language, how to be sociologically adaptive and contextualize the gospel and be as incarnational as possible. And I think this is that time right now where nobody has a choice. We all have to adapt. We all have to keep learning every day. And so I wanted to share I thought these things would be really helpful to start with, to frame kind of how we're thinking about this. Mark has a lot of great stuff about just practically how to, the church can begin to implement and think about concretely how to re-enter sort of our new society. But Don, do I just hit share screen? Is that how this works?
Yes.
Let's see. I've never shared my screen before. It's saying I have to quit Zoom to share my screen or something. Okay.
It said that to me
works?
before, and then you kind of cancel, and then it just kind of worked at one point for me. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. You're seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a document, a PDF that I'm going to be.
Bigger.
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
Okay.
Is that bigger or that didn't do it? Can everybody read that?
That's better.
It's better.
Just scroll down.
Okay.
Scroll
all right.
down
Sorry about that, guys.
Scroll it down. There you go.
I can't see what you all are seeing. Is that how it works?
Just whatever's on your screen.
Okay. All right, guys. So I've been thinking about, I'm going to share this document with you. It's a PDF that I can share with you. But I've been thinking about what's been most helpful to me and to the people that I've been interacting with. So I want to start with a psychological theory that's really helpful. And it's a theory called Self-Determination Theory. Can you read that part?
Yes.
Okay. Self-Determination Theory is a theory behind the question, where do human beings get our sense of well-being? Where do we experience, how do we experience our sort of will to live? How do we have energy flowing from us and through us? How are we motivated? Where do we get our sense of purpose? How are we activated? And ultimately, where does our hope come from? This feeling of hope. And smarter people than us, they've been thinking about this for a long time, for decades, and they came up with this comprehensive theory called self-determination theory. And the three components of self-determination theory are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And autonomy is speaking to our sense of freedom or self-control, ability to direct our own lives. Competence refers to our abilities, our skills, our talent. And relatedness is our sense of belonging and obligation and love. And so when we have these three categories in play in our lives, we experience something called well-being. We experience a sense of motivation, and we look out in the world and we feel a sense of hope. But you realize, because of what's happening in our world and because of the lockdown that we're all living under, our sense of autonomy, for example, has significantly decreased. And so if you're wondering why you are beginning to feel like you're dying a little bit on the inside, and you have less energy or less will to live, less motivation, and for some reason you just don't feel well, it might be autonomy. Or we have significantly less competence than we used to. We can't practice what we're good at. We literally can't get out there. And so we begin to experience a diminishing in our will to live. And then obviously a big one is relatedness. We're disconnected from each other. And so much of how we function, how we even understand reality, how we move about, and how we feel okay is when we are connected to each other. And this is why, for example, solitary confinement is categorized as torture. It's torturous to be disconnected from each other. And so Dr. Henry Cloud talked about these three things as well in a link that I will share. But it's a very powerful theory, and it's a good way to check in with yourself and with other people. Like if you have people that you care for. For me, I have 4 little kids, and I really see how when these three things are not lacking in their life, they're just not feeling well. They're not doing well. They're symptomizing. They're acting out. And then if I can somehow find a way to turn up the dial on some of these things, then I immediately see energy enter their bodies again, and their spirits are uplifted. And so it's been a quick way to kind of assess the situation, assess myself, and to pray and to ask God for specific needs. Maybe we'll do a Q&A at the end, but the second thing I wanted to mention is this chart, well-being versus engagement. And another quick tool to use. And so if you look at this chart, it's got 4 quadrants, and these quadrants are labeled as disconnected, flourishing, distressed and disengaged, and distressed but functional. And on the horizontal axis, we have engagement going left to right. And then on the vertical axis, going from down to up, we have well-being. And so we can see that when we are highly engaged and we're doing well personally, we're in the quadrant that's up and to the right, and that's flourishing, right? If you move over to the left from there, we have disconnected, where you are doing well, but you're not engaged in your work. And then to the bottom and to the left, we have somebody who is not doing well and they're not engaged. And that's somebody who is distressed and disengaged. And then on the right, we have somebody who is engaged, but not doing well personally. And the reason that's in red, I put it in red because that's the burnout zone. And so if you keep going, but you're not taking care of yourself, you're not checking in with yourself, you're at risk for getting burnt out. Now, this tool is really helpful to check in with yourself. You can sort of say, how engaged am I in what I need to do today? And how am I doing personally? Right? And you can sort of diagnose yourself. And then you can use this tool to sort of get a sense for how people around you are doing. If you are a manager at work, for example, you can use this to see how your colleagues are doing at work. As a dad, I use this with my kids. I see that one of my kids, they're not doing well, but they're engaged in their schoolwork. So then I ask, how can I help them to do well personally? So our family, we've been doing time-ins together kind of forcing my kids to share about how they're doing personally. Or maybe you have a spouse who is a little bit disconnected, but they're doing well, but they're not being as helpful or something like that. So it's just a quick read of people. Okay, if I go to the second page here, just a few thoughts before I turn it over to Mark and Greg here. One factor that this pandemic and the lockdown is testing is our resilience versus our strength. We all know that the pyramids were amazing structures. They were very, what some might call strong, but most of them don't exist anymore because even though they were strong, they're not resilient. Or you can compare that to a forest, and a forest is not very strong. It's very delicate. It's a well-balanced ecosystem, but it's very resilient. And so you can burn an entire forest down and it will come back. And so at a time like this, it really calls for a kind of resilience, even more than strength, a kind of ability to adapt, to stretch, and to work with what you've been given. Related to that, there is the myth of plan and implement. Nobody's ever planned and implemented exactly as they have planned. If you read books or watch movies on how NASA gets their spacecrafts up into space, they do all this planning, but on the day of, they have to do everything in their power to adapt. That's just the way reality works. And so if NASA can't do it, I certainly can't plan and adapt. And so what the alternative to planning and adapting, planning and implementing, is planting and adapting. And that's the idea that you do your best, you plant it in the soil, and then you have to garden it, you have to tend to it, you have to do all that you can to adapt it to its environment and create help create a helpful environment. So that's just another thought. Okay, next is this idea of how we begin to think about our churches and what are the ways that our churches can succeed when society begins to reemerge from this lockdown. And I get this from a business guy, but he says that this guy, he has studied probably, I think it was like a few hundred Silicon Valley organizations. And this is just based on his analysis of these organizations. And he says that the single most important element to consider for the success of an organization is what he calls timing. And timing has to do with the wave that we are able to catch, the factors we can control. An example that he gives, he says that the iPhone, for example, succeeded precisely because Steve Jobs understood timing. If there was a iPhone that came out a year before, it would have failed because the bandwidth just wasn't there. And so the internet couldn't be accessed the way it was. And so the timing of the iPhone was more important than the iPhone itself. And then this guy says that the second most important factor is the implementation or the team that's able to execute. So thinking about these two factors for your church, you might ask the question, what is this season calling for us to do? What are the factors that are beyond our control that we adapt ourselves to? Rather than what do we want to keep doing, what do we want to revert back to? If those things don't fit the timing when you reemerge, it's not going to probably work as well. The most important question is to ask, what is this moment about, or Kairos moment? And then the second question is, who's the team that's going to implement this strategy? Okay. A couple of reminders here as we end my portion. I think that this is an opportunity to observe our churches and Christianity itself and our practice of it from an emotional distance that we've never been able to have before, because we're sort of in the throes of it. There's a rhythm to it. There's a tyranny to the 7-day week. And we have to do church. We have to put on the show. And we have to be functional. But right now, we have the luxury of slowing down. We have the luxury of having less pressure. We have less conflicts of interest at play. And so it's really an opportunity to ask deeper, more probing questions. And so as I did that and I sort of mingled it with some of the things I've been reading and the conversations I've been having, there are 5 things that I think this pandemic is giving us the opportunity to lean into. Number 1, I think this pandemic has a revealing function. It's sort of showing things for what they are, what they've been. Secondly, it has an accelerating function, meaning that whatever was going to happen, it's going to happen even faster. For example, we do know that because of the internet and because of the way we access information and relationships, attendance across the board, across the country in churches have been generally in decline. People are less sort of tied to the idea of coming to a place, right? We know that was true, but now this pandemic is really revealing that, and it's going to accelerate that. That's the new reality that may emerge. A third function of this pandemic is it's having a forcing function. It's forcing us to accept reality in ways that we can be in denial before, right? For example, small groups we knew were always a really good thing. Some churches leaned into them, some churches didn't. But this pandemic and the way that our churches may have to reopen may force us to really embrace small groups, or force us to embrace technology, or force us to adapt to a new reality. A fourth function that this pandemic is having is it's having a flattening function, meaning that there's an invitation, I think, by the Holy Spirit to lean more heavily into the priesthood of all believers. We just won't be as dependent on the solo leader anymore, or the guru model, or the cult of personality model of what it means to be church. There's a greater invitation for many members in the body to rise up to their areas of specialty or giftedness. And I think we're going to see that more and more. And then lastly, it has a focusing function. It's forcing us to ask the question, what's really important? What's really church about? I've been realizing that church is really powerful, and it shines a warm, inviting light when it's missional, when it's really existing for other people. And this pandemic is highlighting that. Or it's really highlighting that church is about people and community, and we really, really miss each other. And that's a core function of the church. There's lots of other things that the church does, but it just doesn't seem as important or as important as it used to. And so it helps us to focus on our core functions. As we think about this, I think it's really important to be non-judgmental and acknowledging of the past seasons. If we're going to be saying goodbye to certain paradigms or constructs or ministries or ways of doing things, this isn't a judgment on those things. Those things played a part, and they've run their life cycle, and we acknowledge it, and we're thankful. And then we let it die a peaceful death, and then we embrace the new. And that's how change is done best. Lastly is I want to point you to this article, and it's also a podcast written by this owner and chef at a famous restaurant in New York City. And it's a really well done story. And the way she thinks through the life time of her 20-year-old restaurant and the conclusions she comes to and the questions that emerge for her, I thought were really parallel to churches. And so I thought that it would be a good meditation for you all as you think about church in the next season. That's it from me.
Thank you, Peter. And just to reiterate from the chat, we will be making these resources available on our website within the next few days, including the recording.
And I'll share this PDF with you all right now over chat here.
That's great. All right. So, Mark Meredith, you're up.
Hey, good to be with you all. You know, my stuff's a little more down to earth than Peter, and
perfect.
Yeah. So mostly from the stuff I've got is from a couple of the Vanderbloemen, which was one of Peter's resources. You can get that website from him, but there was one a week ago, and it was actually large church pastors talking. But the one yesterday was small to medium churches. And I think the big thing that came out of there, and it was right off the bat, and these were 5 or 6 churches from around the nation, and that is that the expectation of reopening in terms of being together as a church by all these churches was, I hope this doesn't shock anybody, but it's late summer. And that would obviously be different depending on where you are in terms of rural to urban and so forth. But that's the expectation. And the other thing that's been a question mark, I'm sure we've all had, is what does it mean, as most of us have gone to online presence, what does that look like once we're back in some form of real presence? And the answer was clearly, at least from all these churches, was that you'll never go back to a time when you're not in some virtual presence also on a Sunday. So it's a both and future. And as they talk through the reasons for that, I just wanted to maybe highlight a few of those, because they're really some good reasons for that. And there's also obviously some cautions. But it allows the person who is exploring Christianity a back row seat that is safer than any back row. That would be in their living room, and they can get a taste of what this is all about without having to feel threatened by just walking into a new place. That would be one. Another one is college students who oftentimes lose track. There's no church in their lives when they go to college, and now they can go to their home church on a Sunday. People who are on vacation, people who are traveling on business, just a lot of good reasons for maintaining an online presence on Sunday morning. So virtually I'd say all of these small to mid-sized churches were either resigned or really excited about the idea of a permanent online presence. So that was something I picked up and I share with you. The other thing that is on everybody's mind is how does it open up? And let's say it's August, and the data that is driving the decisions that those in authority are making or suggesting towards churches, what would that look like? And with all that into the picture, we know it's going to be gradual. And so a couple of churches suggested, first of all, meeting once it's safe and once it seems right for people in churches to gather together in homes. They can continue to watch the online services from the home together. Maybe up to 12 people or whatever the regulations allow, and then expand that as things get safer. One thing that everybody agrees with is that whatever the experts are saying isn't going to determine whether people gather or not, as much as just how people are feeling with their own anxieties. So you're going to have to ease into this. And one caution is to not shame anybody who is slow in coming back to the church and preferring to watch online, and to treat those groups much the same. They have different levels of caution. And to be the body of Christ is to embrace both of those groups. So those are just a few practical things that came out of that time yesterday. And I'll just share a few more, and then if there's Q&A, we can do that as well. But the hardest thing people recognize was probably going to be children's ministry, because of whatever social distancing you have in place doesn't work very well for kids under a certain age. And so a lot of question marks in that area of how do we do children's ministry. Pastoral care, I think we're all finding right now, there's new possibilities abounding in that area that were not there a couple of months ago. People are more open to expressing their emotions and where their needs are. Giving, at least in the churches that were interviewed yesterday, all of them were down a tick, but not a lot. And so it remains to be seen how giving will hold up. Technology is something that you have to acknowledge. There are haves and have-nots in the technological world. And schools right now are finding that out, that there are some kids that can do online learning well because they're well equipped to do it, and other kids are not learning because they're not. So same with churches. We have people in churches who they just don't get some of the basics of being in a meeting like this. And how do you not prejudice the differences that are there? Committee meetings, the good news is there won't be as many committee meetings on a Wednesday night at church, but those meetings will probably be shorter and online, and I'm hearing that a lot. But small groups where people don't know each other as well will always be, or the likelihood is that they will go back to being in real presence. Programming, I thought this was really interesting. People are not missing programming for the most part. What people are missing are the essentials of the Christian faith throughout the centuries. Worship, prayer, communion, relationship. It's that kind of stuff. And what does that say to us with all of our emphasis on programming? So anyway, those were, I'll just stop right there. That's enough to, yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, thank you for giving some thoughts here. So Greg, do you want to follow up and add anything?
Just riff off of Mark's stuff. I'm going to share my screen here. So you'll find a lot of what Mark just shared on some of this here. But these are the areas that we've been considering. So obviously, we don't know if it's going to be a late summer or, what kind of timeline. But as I mentioned earlier, it's most definitely, I would say 99.9% certainty that it's going to be a staged approach. So we're probably going to go to okay, we're going to reopen to some level in the beginning, and only 10 people can gather, or only 20 people can gather, or some variation of that. And so just kind of working through that. And I've loved hearing from different churches that they have already formed task forces to just be able to think through a lot of the details that we're covering here. How do we approach these different scenarios, whether it be scenario planning financially that we've been encouraging you all in past Zoom meetings, but now just how do we do scenario planning with our reopening? Okay, so getting a team, don't just shoulder that alone, especially for those of you in smaller churches. Get a team around you and get the wisdom of the group going. A lot of conversation about building prep and space, and so I know a lot of churches are using this time to kind of, let's do road construction while people are not, on the roads. And so in similar fashion, let's do building maintenance, deferred maintenance, blah, 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 while we don't have people in the building. When we were broadcasting from Newport, that's what they were doing on Friday, was getting ready for a fire inspection and that kind of thing. But also, you need to start thinking through what you have been experiencing at Home Depot and at your restaurant, with how they have spaced us out, and how we're standing in lines and the lines on the floor. And I mean, not to that extent necessarily, but it's part of the stage reentry is going to be social distancing still being in place. all the stuff that we were doing with hygiene as we were launching into this quarantine, all of that's going to come back into place. It's probably going to involve masks initially, perhaps. But having all of those considerations around the offering plate and communion and door handles and what are your greeters going to be, you know, what do they need to be trained in, all of this kind of stuff we need to be thinking about as far as the building prep and spaces. So I just echo as far as what Mark was sharing around children's ministries. I would also say with senior ministries, on one hand, they're like the most faithful, right? They're the ones that are driving checks to your mailbox right now because they don't want to do the online thing still. But these are folks that also are probably the most scared, right? Are the most vulnerable. And so senior ministries is going to be very different going forward as well. So online presence, same thing that the guys said. I think that one thing that we're learning is, you know, we're now, you know, somewhat experts at this. Let's use that wonderful gift that we've been given and just continue to have that new on-ramp as part of an ongoing thing. Also with the program changes that I got there in the gray, not just like what Mark was saying about the children's ministries, but one webinar I was on was saying that closed-end groups are here to stay. Not the open-ended groups, you know, that are the small groups that are kind of meeting indefinitely. They're going to want to be together still. But we've learned a lot about how we can deliver closed-end group experiences that could be very effective. I just saw on Radiant's site yesterday that they're doing a 5 weeks, I think it's 5-week or 10-week series for married couples. And certainly that's going to be better online. I mean, better in person. But I think there's closed-in groups that we can think about. Like, can we do 2/3 of our membership class in a closed-in online group, and then 1/3 of it in person that warms it up relationally, right? There's some real good thinking around that. What are we learning that we can actually do differently and actually more effectively, where people can would be willing to access it faster than hearing an announcement that membership class, come to a membership class on Saturday morning, right? And so those are some of the things that I'll add there. I think if I missed anything, I think that's it. So questions. I think we'll go into questions on Dawn. Would that be a good thing?
Yeah, sure. Preferably through the chat.
Yes.
I think would be helpful. I did put in the chat the a reflection piece, which is the compass exercise. If you want to do that, maybe as a leadership team or a staff team, and it asks some good questions to reflect on this season and what it's been like, and some of those things that even Peter was referring to, where what are you learning? What are the new things that are emerging during this season? So that gives a chance as a team to pray through that and then talk through it. So I just offer that. We have, okay, Mark Elmervik is offering in the chat a resource as well. Thank you. In my conversations, as we're just waiting, if you have questions to ask or other resources, certainly I appreciate what Mark had to say about demographics and you knowing your context really well and gauging the comfort level of your community in terms of returning. And been interesting to talk to pastors, you know, even who are themselves trying to figure out, how do I feel about returning and being in the context of a group as well? And, you know, that we all are trying to figure that out. And I especially appreciate what you said, Mark, about, you know, without judgment, we just have to appreciate and understand everyone's trying to navigate and process their anxiety at different levels and the connections they have and the vulnerable populations that they're connected to. So offering that variety is good. We have a question. Have we considered how to do social distancing on a Sunday morning with seating? Mark and Peter, Greg, have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I saw Nick's question. One thing that churches are considering, and I just want to just throw this out there, there's many answers, but if they've only had a Sunday service in the past, would be to maybe have a Saturday service. So you have a part of the congregation come on one day and a part on the next. I've heard that from many places.
Yep.
Yeah, so part of that stage approach, just spreading out on a Sunday, using overflow spaces to accommodate some of that. Larger churches are needing to consider multiple services.
Mark Mathis has asked, and what have churches learned, or have they grown at all through this, or empowered in reaching out beyond just their community? So what does outreach even look like?
I'll take a shot at that one.
Oh, go ahead, Peter.
I've been hearing that the two factors that seems to have helped churches thrive initially, I don't know how sustainable it is, but churches that were bent towards being missional, whose identity was wrapped around helping other people, these churches seem to be thriving in terms of engagement and in terms of giving. And so, and then the other factor are churches that already had some tech savvy and were ready for online giving or already doing that. These churches have seen their giving go up, and there's been some energy. Some of the smaller congregations who were both of these things but just didn't feel like they were reaching enough people in terms of Sunday attendance. Some of them have seen 10x rise in their church attendance online. So a church of 80 have seen 800 people show up. So that's been an interesting phenomenon.
That's great.
I want to highlight Barbara Moffitt's comment there in the chat. I think that is, I think one of the things that we're learning is whether or not our discipleship focus has been robust or not, has been healthy or not. And definitely part of the stage return, if we're only allowed to be in groups of 10 or smaller numbers, is just spotlighting, putting a greater emphasis on small group ministries, i.e., home church type of approach. This is in our roots, right, as Covenanters, as far as conventicles, to throw out a good covenant out there. These were the early Covenanters that gathered around the word, and the missional temperature was fanned into flame in those small groups. So how can we look at the house church model as maybe some of the beginning steps? It's really excellent. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah, just to emphasize that. I mean, personally, I feel like I've learned, having been a part of a small group, even the last few years, how critical that group has become to my well-being, to use Peter's word there, in these couple months. And I totally applaud that thought that maybe this will encourage churches to go back to that model if they haven't been doing it, because that has become church for me in these past couple months. I can speak personally about that. There's many questions and ideas that are kind of floating here in the chat, and a lot of them about ideas, how people are thinking about spacing or wondering about how to do that. So I encourage you to kind of read what people are trying. Okay, someone had an answer to kind of the outreach. Dan Bolgi at Cascades Covenant, we're doing the World Vision Global 6K for water in neighborhoods and having success in inviting non-church members. That's a really good melding of the one thing that we can do right now, which is, if with social distancing, walk outside. So that's great. But how do we move viewers, I love that question, from online to becoming engaged participants? Has anyone has a story to tell around that? How to move people from just checking in online to actually getting engaged? What are thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure if I quite understand, but one of the churches yesterday that I was listening in on was their video presence is very outward focused, and so they've thought through a little bit larger church. But they actually ask people to give their contact information, just like you would pass the thing down the row. And so they've had new people, and then new people that have come to church online, and then they've gotten some of those people into smaller groups. So that I don't know how that's going to work for everybody, but that's one way.
Yeah, similarly, I don't know how long they've been doing this, but I was on Evergreen's service this past Sunday, and when they got to that welcome section, they then posted the link to their website that was the welcome card, and so they were able. They encourage people to fill it out that way. Yeah. I think it's an on-ramp, right? I think this is providing an opportunity for people to check things out and for creating more space for the Holy Spirit to move and what the Lord is doing in an individual life, and then just giving more opportunities to be more connected, just like you would in an in-person situation. That's the real key.
And then, creating opportunity to do a Zoom, I imagine, online with newcomers, in a smaller format, a group format. All right.
Some great ideas on the chat. Hope
Yeah.
Thanks for that offer from West Hills and Pastor Stephanie down there.
Yep. Anyone else?
If I could just, some of what Peter said earlier, my version of what he tried to say with the mindset thing would be from last week, a church planter webinar thing, but is that to look at the fall of 2020 as a time to relaunch your church and to really think in terms of relaunching. There have been people, and you may be in that group, that have prayed for revival for years, and this may be the answer to your prayers. Some, and I'm not going to say this phrase, but some are saying that the worst thing you can say right now is, how do we get back to normal? You have to ask yourself, was normal really what the God's best for us? And I don't know, I think we need to hear that prophetic voice right now. So I just wanted to get that in there.
Yes, exactly. Definitely an opportunity not to just go back, but to really discern the new way forward. Good. Sharon is offering some thoughts for pastoral care, which I appreciate. Other ways of gathering people and caring through those tried and true ministries there, but doing it online. Stephen is reminding us of grant money, relief grant money offered by the Covennat, and he shared the link there to the Covennat website. Okay. Anyone else with a question, or our presenters?
If you kind of take that 4-quadrant chart, well-being versus engagement chart, and you sort of ask that about your church, I wonder what answer you would come up with. How well was your church doing? And how engaged were its people? And you can kind of get a sense for maybe to help answer what Mark was saying about revival. I can't imagine there's one church out there going, I loved it exactly the way it was. This is the church that Jesus held his membership at. And so I think there's room for revival in every church, and what church means. How do we do spirituality together? What the fat was that we can trim. what a better reallocation of resources might look like. How do we shift a paradigm that we've always wanted to do, but we haven't been able to do in times prior? So, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Just a reminder about the In It Together Benevolence Fund that we've been collecting here in the conference. For churches that are struggling through this time, as well as you see your own benevolence funds maybe thinning out, we really want to come alongside. It's been a beautiful expression from churches and individuals that are really wanting to be supportive of folks that are having a tough time during this pandemic. So just let us know here in the office. Any one of the staff could be helpful that way. Great.
At what size of permitted group should services start up again? Has anyone given this some thought? I mean, it seems like it would be dependent on your sanctuary and how much space people could have, but.
Yeah, all of those considerations around spacing is definitely going to be an issue. But I also would say this is a church by church situation where it's your own culture there at the church. It's your own level of, trust and relatedness. There's just so much that goes into there locally that you need to weigh. But it's going to be guided by whatever we're allowed to do. There might be some, I hear it's been really hard for Sunday production teams, particularly for pastors, to do these things to an empty room. So maybe it's mostly online, but you have a smaller group that's in the church and people get to alternate or something like that. I mean, there's just real creative ways to approach it that way. Yeah, from Sherrod, just as far as healthcare workers, we've been hearing an outpouring of different and creative ways people have done this. There have been churches that have provided meals for their local hospitals. I know West Hills, they highlight those in their church, in their sphere, that are healthcare workers, and they are praying for them and name those people and put them up front. I know that churches, Quest had their children draw up pictures and send blessings to local healthcare workers. But certainly just doing the good and important ministry and work of prayer is huge. My wife, who is a pediatrician, just got a card from our home church, my home church in Oakland. And that was just really lovely to be able to receive that, just knowing that people are praying for you.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you all. I think we'll bring this to a close here. And again, we will be repeating this on Thursday, and feel free to sign up again if you want to kind of, there will be other people on the call, and we will continue to add resources as we find it. Greg, I'm wondering if you can close us in prayer.
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks for being on.
Right, before you start, could I offer one answer to a question that was asked? I thought that might be helpful
sure.
for the whole group to hear. Just one of the questions was, how can we help the medical workers, frontline workers? And I have a story about this. I have a friend of mine who started a restaurant in New York City not too long ago, and they were hit with this pandemic. And then serendipitously, they got into providing free meals to frontline healthcare workers through donations. And so they've been getting over $30,000 in donations per month. And so they've been able to stay afloat as a restaurant, and the workers have been getting blessed. And so if you wanted a way for your church members to bless the frontline workers, that's a great, to organize, to partner up with a local restaurant or something and have them deliver the food to the hospitals. I know that's thing that's happening across the country, but in case you didn't know that.
great.
Okay. Let me just close this. God, thank you so much for all the folks on the call today and all the churches that are represented here for our church, for our denominational church family. God, we just continue to lean into you, who is our rock, our unchanging one, the one that is dependable, the one that is faithful, the one that loves us completely, and the one that is all powerful and in control. God, we need to make that our confession because there's just so much swirling around us, so many questions, so many unknowns. But God, our faith is in you and you alone. So would you just grant us your wisdom, grant us your discernment as you continue to call us to lead your church. So God, we continue to say yes to you with great joy and anticipation for the ongoing building of your church and of your kingdom in these places. God, we lift up all of these leaders to you and their families and the church families that are represented. Keep them safe, Lord. Keep them healthy. Keep them encouraged by your Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everybody.
Amen. Thank you.
I'm praying for you.
Take care. Bye-bye.